The air in the county shelter was thick, a foul cocktail of industrial disinfectant, damp wool, and the faint, sour smell of unwashed bodies. Clara lay stiffly on the narrow cot, its springs groaning with every shallow breath she took. She listened. The rhythmic symphony of misery surrounded her, a dry, hacking cough from the far corner, the rustle of a restless sleeper on a plastic mattress, and, closest to her, the soft, innocent whisper of her son, Leo's breathing. A profound ache settled deep in her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the draft slipping through the window frames, and everything to do with the hollowness in her stomach. Her heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of pure dread. She hadn't slept in 2 nights. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford when the darkness was filled with the looming specter of tomorrow. Every creak of the building sent a jolt of anxiety through her. A fresh reminder that this wasn't a home. It was a holding pen. Just a week ago, there was the sharp final click of a deadbolt sliding into place. That sound echoed in her mind, louder than the indifferent city traffic. The landlord hadn't even looked her in the eye. He just wanted them gone. She could still feel the rough texture of the sidewalk beneath her fingers as she knelt to repack a bag that had spilled open. Her face burning with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. All their worldly possessions, 2 duffel bags and her grandmother's heavy sewing machine, sat on the curb like trash. The mill had been her life. The rhythmic clatter of the looms, the smell of dye and hot machinery, the feel of raw cotton transforming into bolts of fabric under her skilled hands. Now, her hands felt clumsy and empty. She had promised Leo they'd be okay after his father left. She had promised him stability. That promise was now a bitter taste in her mouth, the acrid flavor of failure. A silent tear escaped and traced a cold path down her temple. She reached into the pocket of her worn jeans, her fingers brushing against the crumpled paper. $50. A 20, 2 10s, and 2 5s. She had counted it so many times the bills were soft and fragile, threatening to disintegrate just like her hope. It was their entire fortune. $50 standing between her son and true starvation. She turned her head on the lumpy pillow, her gaze falling on Leo. In the dim emergency light filtering through the large, grimy window, his face looked impossibly small and pale. His dark hair was matted with sweat. She could hear a faint rumble from his stomach, even in his sleep. A wave of nausea coiled in her gut, hot and acidic, the weight of his small, trusting hand, which had slipped into hers as he drifted off to sleep, was an anchor of love pulling her down into a sea of despair. Her body screamed with hunger, but the pain in her heart was infinitely worse. How could she feed him tomorrow? Beside her cot, casting a long shadow, was the sewing machine, an old black cast-iron Singer, ornate with faded gold decals. It had been her grandmother's, then her mother's, and now it was hers. It was heavy, so incredibly heavy. Lugging it from the apartment to the shelter felt like carrying a tombstone. It was the tool of her trade, the one thing she owned that held any real value, both sentimental and practical. Yet, here, it was just a useless, heavy lump of metal. There was no electricity, no space, no fabric. It sat there as a monument to her former life, a silent, iron-clad accusation of her inability to provide. The cold, smooth metal felt alien under her touch, a stark contrast to the warm, living skin of her son. The machine was a promise of creation, of stitching things together, but all Clara felt was the world around her coming apart at the seams, thread by painful thread. The shelter had a 7-day limit. Their time was up tomorrow. The thought sent a fresh tremor of panic through her. Tomorrow, they would be back on the street. Her mind frantically searched for an escape, a solution, any sliver of light, but found only a vast, terrifying emptiness. Charleston had nothing left for her. The mill was a tomb, its gates chained shut. Her friends from work were scattered, each fighting their own desperate battles. She felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, a weariness that went beyond her physical body. It was a fatigue of the soul. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the image of Leo's hungry face was burned onto the back of her eyelids. A quiet sob caught in her throat, a painful, jagged thing. The darkness in the room felt absolute, a physical presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot of pure, undiluted hopelessness. There was nowhere to go. There was nothing left. The next morning, a staff member with a tired, impassive face called her name. The abrupt sound cut through the low hum of the shelter. "Clara, letter for you." Clara's heart gave a painful lurch. A letter? No one wrote to her. Her first thought was a jolt of pure fear. A collection agency. A final notice she'd somehow missed. She took the crisp, white envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. It felt alien in her hand, clean and official amidst the grime and desperation of her current reality. A law firm's name was embossed in the corner. Her breath caught in her throat. She slid her nail under the flap, the sound of tearing paper unnaturally loud in the quiet room. A heavy, formal stationery unfolded, covered in dense or black type. It smelled faintly of expensive ink and an air-conditioned office, a scent from another world entirely. This was not a bill. This was something else. The words swam before her eyes, a blur of legal jargon she couldn't immediately comprehend. Then certain phrases leaped out at her, stark and unbelievable against the page. Last will and testament, Jedediah Croft, great uncle. And then the two words that made her heart stop, sole heir. She vaguely remembered a gruff, bearded man from a single family visit when she was a child, a recluse her mother spoke of in hushed, pitying tones. The letter stated he had passed away, leaving her his only known possession, a small plot of land and a cabin in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a property, a roof. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to steady herself against a metal bunk bed. A fragile, tentative hope began to bloom in the barren wasteland of her chest, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. She looked over at Leo, still sleeping, and felt a surge of adrenaline. This could be it. This could be their escape. The decision was both instant and agonizing. The bus ticket to the closest town, a place called Harlan Junction, would cost $43. It would leave them with $7. $7 and a prayer. The lawyer's letter was frustratingly vague, offering no details about the condition of the cabin, only its location. But the unknown was infinitely better than the terrifying certainty of the streets of Charleston. She felt a reckless, desperate resolve solidify within her. It was a blind leap of faith into a dark abyss, but it was a leap away from the hell she was in. She used the shelter's payphone, her voice a reedy whisper as she booked the ticket. The sound of her last few dollars being spent was the sound of a match being struck in a pitch-black tunnel. It could either light the way forward or be instantly snuffed out, leaving her in an even deeper darkness than before. It was a gamble for their very survival. The Greyhound station was a cacophony of noise and frantic energy. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of diesel fumes, stale coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of popcorn from a greasy machine. Announcements for departures to Cincinnati and Richmond crackled unintelligibly over a distorted PA system. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a sense of forward momentum, even if it was terrifying. She clutched Leo's small hand, her knuckles white. The sewing machine, heavy and awkward in a canvas bag, bumped against her leg with every step, a constant, burdensome reminder of her past and her uncertain future. She felt the fleeting, indifferent glances of other travelers, their eyes sliding over her and her meager possessions. In their faces, she saw a reflection of what she was, a woman on the edge, clutching a child's hand and running on the fumes of a desperate hope, a nameless face in the river of humanity, flowing toward an unknown destination. The bus pulled away from the station with a deep groan and a hiss of air brakes. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass of the window, watching the familiar, grim skyline of Charleston recede until it was nothing more than a smudge of grey on the horizon. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on the window pane, a silent goodbye to a life that had completely unraveled. The rhythmic thrum of the engine was a monotonous lullaby, a sound of transit that was neither here nor there. Leo, excited by the novelty of the journey, chattered beside her, but his voice seemed distant, muffled by the roaring in her own ears. Was she doing the right thing? The question hammered in her mind in time with the wheels on the pavement. Was she leading her son to salvation, or simply to a more remote and desolate form of ruin? The landscape outside blurred into an indistinct smear of green and grey. As the hours passed, the flat highways gave way to winding, two-lane roads that snaked deep into the heart of Appalachia. The mountains rose around them, ancient and formidable, their peaks shrouded in a persistent, clinging mist. The bus groaned and strained as it climbed the steep grades, the engine whining in protest. The forest pressed in on all sides, a dense, impenetrable wall of hemlock and oak. The sheer scale of the wilderness was breathtaking, but it didn't bring Clara any peace. It felt threatening. The isolation was profound. For miles at a time, there were no houses, no stores, no signs of human life, just the endless yet rolling sea of trees. A primal anxiety began to creep into her heart. She was a city woman, used to the grid of streets and the constant presence of people. This vast, untamed nature felt like a living entity, indifferent and powerful, and she felt impossibly small and vulnerable within it. "Harlan Junction!" the driver's voice boomed, startling her from her anxious trance. The bus slowed, pulling over to the side of the road with another hydraulic hiss. Clara looked out the window and her stomach plummeted. Harlan Junction wasn't a town, it was a crossroads, a single, dilapidated building with boarded-up windows and a faded, peeling sign that once read gas stood as a lonely monument to a forgotten time. They stepped off the bus onto the gravel shoulder. The heavy door swung shut, and the bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking in the distance until they vanished completely. A profound, unnerving silence descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the tall pines and the frantic chirping of unseen insects. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. The last link to the world they knew was gone. The isolation was no longer a feeling. It was a physical presence, wrapping around them like a cold, wet blanket. The lawyer's directions had been simple: 2 miles east down the old logging road. Lugging the sewing machine, its weight digging a sharp, burning line into her shoulder, Clara started walking. Leo, his earlier excitement now completely evaporated, trotted along beside her, his small hand locked in hers. The road was little more than a pair of muddy ruts carved into the earth, slick with recent rain. Within minutes, her thin sneakers were soaked through, and the cold mud squelched with every miserable step. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like spectres at the edge of her vision. The forest loomed on either side, a solid wall of darkness. She could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes watching from the trees. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of fear through her exhausted body. This was a wild, lonely place, and she felt her city-forged courage crumbling with every passing yard. After what felt like an eternity of trudging through the deepening twilight, a shape materialized in a small clearing ahead. A dark, sagging silhouette against the bruised purple sky. The cabin. For a fleeting moment, a tiny spark of her desperate hope rekindled. It was a structure. It had 4 walls and a roof. It was real. "We're here, Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking with relief and exhaustion. "We're home." But as they drew closer, the word home died on her lips, tasting like ash. The silhouette resolved into a vision of complete and utter decay. This wasn't a home. It was a carcass. The fragile hope that had carried her all this way didn't just fade. It shattered into a million pieces, the sharp edges twisting in her gut. She stopped dead, the heavy sewing machine slipping from her numb fingers and landing with a soft thud in the mud. Her journey had ended not at a sanctuary, but at a gravestone. The smell was the first wave of the assault, hitting her with physical force. It was a thick, gagging miasma of rot. The sweet, putrid scent of decaying wood, of years of trapped dampness, of mildew that had consumed every surface. It was blended with the sharp, ammonia-like stench of animal nests and the stagnant odor of standing water. Clara's stomach recoiled violently. She instinctively clamped a hand over her mouth and nose, but the smell was too pervasive. It clung to the air, seeping into her clothes, her hair, her very lungs. It was the smell of absolute abandonment, a foul proclamation that this place had long ago been surrendered to the forces of nature and decay. Leo started coughing, a dry, hacking sound, burying his face into the fabric of her jeans as if he could hide from the suffocating odor that promised only sickness and ruin. Her hope had been built on a fantasy, and this smell was the brutal, inescapable reality. Then her eyes took in the full, horrifying detail. The front porch sagged at a perilous angle, its planks warped and splintered, with several missing entirely, revealing the dark, muddy earth beneath like broken teeth in a skull. The roof was a tattered patchwork of weathered shingles and gaping black holes, through which she could see the last vestiges of the evening light. The windows were empty, cavernous sockets, some crudely covered with mismatched, rotting boards that looked like they would disintegrate at the slightest touch. A single shutter hung from a rusted hinge, banging a bleak, rhythmic tattoo against the wall with every gust of wind. It was the only sound of movement, a lonely, desolate percussion accompanying the silent scene of destruction. The image burned itself into her mind, a perfect portrait of her failure. She hadn't found a safe harbor. She had steered them directly into the rocks. She forced herself to move forward, her feet feeling like lead. She reached out a hand to touch the front door, and a shudder of revulsion racked her body. The wood wasn't just old. It felt like a living, diseased thing. It was cold and slimy to the touch, saturated with moisture. When she pushed, the door scraped against the warped floorboards with a long, groaning sound, like a creature in pain. It moved only a few inches before jamming. She put her shoulder to it and shoved, the damp, splintered wood pressing into her thin jacket. A shower of dust, cobwebs, and the papery husks of dead insects rained down from the doorframe, settling in her hair and on her face. Her hands, the same hands that could expertly guide fabric through a machine to create things of order and beauty, were now covered in the filth of decay. The contrast was a bitter, physical thing, a testament to how far she had fallen. Through the narrow opening, a new chorus of horrifying sounds drifted out from the darkness within. The wind, no longer just a whisper in the pines, now howled as it forced its way through 100 unseen cracks in the cabin's walls, creating a low, mournful wail. From a dark corner, the steady, metronomic plink, plink, plink of water dripping from the ruined roof into a puddle on the floor echoed with maddening persistence, but beneath it all was the sound that made her blood run cold. A faint but constant scratching and skittering, the sound of tiny claws on wood, rats, dozens of them. By the sound of it, it was the definitive sound of a place that no longer belonged to people. It had been wholly reclaimed by vermin and rot. The vast, empty silence of the forest now seemed like a blessing compared to the occupied, infested silence within these walls. Leo, who had been quiet until now, let out a terrified sob. It wasn't the petulant whine of a tired child, but a raw, deeply frightened cry that tore through Clara's soul. He clung to her leg, his small body trembling uncontrollably. "I don't like it here, Mommy," he wailed, his voice muffled against the damp denim of her jeans. "It's scary. I want to go home." That one word, home, was a dagger twisted in her heart. They had no home. This dilapidated, foul-smelling ruin was supposed to be their home. She had spent their last dollar, dragged her son across the states and filled his head with promises of a safe place, all for this tomb. A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, rose in her throat, and she had to brace herself against the rotten doorframe, her vision swimming. The last embers of her maternal confidence were snuffed out, leaving only the cold ash of guilt. She sank to her knees in the cold, wet mud, pulling Leo into a desperate, crushing hug as if she could physically shield him from the horror of her mistake. The sewing machine, her last symbol of her former competence and a possible future, lay on its side beside them, its polished black surface splattered with mud. It was a perfect, cruel metaphor for her life. Ruined, useless, discarded in the filth, she had not found refuge. She had found a deeper, more isolated pit of despair than she could ever have imagined. The shelter in Charleston, with its cots and its rules, now seemed like a palace. Here, the isolation was absolute. The cold was seeping into their bones. They had $7, no food, and no viable shelter from the approaching night. This wasn't rock bottom. Rock bottom had been a place with streetlights and other people. This was a place beneath the bottom, a dark, cold grave she had dug for them both. Hot, silent tears of utter hopelessness finally began to fall. 2 weeks crawled by, each day a new circle of a special kind of hell. The initial, sharp shock of despair had settled into a dull, chronic ache that lived in Clara's bones. The relentless cold of the Appalachian autumn had arrived, and the cabin offered little defense against its creeping, damp fingers. She and Leo survived on foraged nuts and the last of the flour. which she cooked into a tasteless, gluey paste over a small and smoky fire outside. Every morning, she felt her resolve crumble a little more, like the rotting wood of the cabin walls. She felt a profound sense of failure, a hollowness that even the gnawing hunger in her stomach couldn't fill. Her hands, once nimble and clean from the textile mill, were now permanently grimy, her nails broken, and her skin cracked from hauling damp wood and patching the endless cracks in the walls with mud and leaves. The isolation was a physical presence, pressing in on them, the silence of the forest broken only by the wind's mournful howl and the skittering of unseen things in the walls at night. The cold was becoming a genuine threat. The nights grew longer, and the temperature dropped with a brutal finality. Leo's persistent, dry cough was a constant, terrifying rhythm in the darkness, a sound that stabbed at Clara's heart with every rasp. One evening, as a freezing rain began to fall, turning the world outside into a slick, grey misery, Clara knew she couldn't risk another night huddled under their single thin blanket in the corner. Her eyes fell upon the huge, looming stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the cabin. It was a monstrous thing, black with decades of soot and draped in thick, sticky cobwebs. It looked as dead and forgotten as everything else in this place, but it was their only hope for real warmth, a desperate long shot against the encroaching hypothermia. A fresh wave of exhaustion washed over her at the thought of the effort, but then she heard Leo cough again, a small, weak sound, and a fierce, primal determination surged through her veins, overriding her fatigue. She had to try. She spent an hour clearing the hearth, her hands growing numb as she scooped out layers of old ash, dirt, and the skeletal remains of long-dead birds that had fallen down the chimney. The smell was acrid, a thick plume of stale soot and decay that filled the small space and made her eyes water. Her back screamed in protest, and a sharp pain shot through her shoulder, but she ignored it. Driven by the image of Leo's pale, shivering form, he sat huddled in the corner, watching her with his large, solemn eyes, his little body wrapped in every piece of spare clothing they owned. She could feel his gaze on her, a silent weight of trust she felt she was failing at every turn. Finally, she cleared a space and carefully arranged the driest pieces of wood she had managed to gather. Her hands trembled as she struck one of her last precious matches. The flame flickered, a tiny, defiant speck of orange in the oppressive gloom. She held her breath, praying it would catch. The hope was so fragile it was painful. The kindling sputtered, smoked, and finally, miraculously, caught. A small, hungry flame began to lick at the larger pieces of wood. A weak, tentative warmth began to push back against the crushing cold. It wasn't much, but it felt like a victory of monumental proportions. Clara sagged with relief, a sob catching in her throat. Leo, drawn by the light and heat, crawled closer, his small hands outstretched towards the fledgling fire. He sat on the stone hearth, his face illuminated by the flickering glow, a faint hint of color returning to his cheeks. As Clara watched him, a fierce, protective love swelled in her chest, so intense it was a physical pain. She would do anything to keep this small flame of life and this small fire from going out. For the first time since they arrived, a tiny, precarious bubble of something other than pure despair formed inside her. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was a quiet moment of reprieve in the midst of their endless struggle for survival. As the fire grew stronger, casting dancing shadows that made the cramped room seem both larger and more menacing, Leo began to fidget. He ran his small fingers over the rough, cold surface of the massive stones that formed the base of the fireplace. "Mommy," he said, his voice quiet. "This one wiggles." Clara, lost in a weary trance, barely registered his words. "Be careful, sweetie. It's all old," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the hypnotic flames. But Leo was persistent. He pushed again, his small body straining with the effort. "No, look," he insisted. There was a low, grating sound, the dry scrape of stone against stone that cut through the crackle of the fire. Clara's head snapped towards him. She saw it then. One of the large, flat hearthstones, right where Leo was sitting, had shifted. It was only an inch, but it was enough to break the solid, ancient line of the structure. A sudden, sharp curiosity pierced through her exhaustion. Why would one stone be loose when the rest was cemented with age? She knelt beside him on the cold floor, her weariness momentarily forgotten. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm. "Let me see, Leo," she whispered, her voice tight. She placed her hands on the stone. It was large and heavy, and its surface was gritty with soot and age. But when she pushed, she felt it give, just as Leo had said. It slid sideways, not with the crumbling decay of the rest of the cabin, but with a smoothness that suggested it was designed to move. An icy tingle, a mix of fear and excitement, traced its way down her spine. This wasn't just another sign of disrepair. This was different. This felt intentional. The first open loop. What was this? She looked at the surrounding stones, all locked firmly in place. Only this one. Her mind, so long consumed with the singular focus of survival, suddenly had a new, sharp point of focus. She had to know what, if anything, lay beneath. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating a new, intense expression. With a grunt of effort, she put her shoulder into it, using her legs to push. Her worn sneakers slipped on the dusty floor, but she braced herself and tried again. The stone was incredibly heavy, and for a moment she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the flickering light and her exhausted mind. But then, with a deep, groaning scrape that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room, the massive stone slid away, revealing a perfect, dark, rectangular opening in the floor beneath. A wave of stale, musty air, colder than the rest of the room, washed over her face. It smelled of deep earth, of secrets, of time itself. It was the smell of a place that had not been opened for a very, very long time. Clara stared into the void, her breath catching in her throat. A profound and unnerving silence seemed to emanate from the hole, a silence that swallowed the crackling of the fire. It was a pocket of absolute darkness, a wound in the heart of the cabin. A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than the fear of starvation, took hold. Leo scrambled back, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fright. "What is it, Mommy?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Clara didn't answer. She was frozen, her mind racing. Who would build such a thing? And why? Was it a root cellar, a place to hide from danger, or something else entirely? She leaned forward, peering into the abyss, but the darkness was total, impenetrable. She felt a primal urge to shove the stone back into place, to pretend they had never found it, to return to the simple, understandable misery of their existence. But a stronger, more powerful force, a burning, desperate curiosity, held her captive. This secret had been waiting here silently. Through all the years of rot and decay, she felt an undeniable pull, a sense of destiny, as if this discovery was not an accident. Her hand trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out another one of her precious matches, her fingers clumsy with a sudden surge of adrenaline. The match flared to life, a tiny star against the oppressive blackness. Holding it carefully, Clara lowered the trembling flame into the opening. The weak light pushed back the shadows, revealing not a deep cellar or a dirt hole, but a small stone-lined compartment, about 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide. It was expertly constructed. The stones fitted together with a precision that stood in stark contrast to the rest of the dilapidated cabin, and in the center of the small chamber, sitting on the cold stone floor, was a box. It wasn't a wooden chest, but a squat, dark shape of metal, its surface mottled with patches of rust that looked like dried blood in the flickering matchlight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. A box, hidden away, a secret deliberately and carefully concealed. The simple fact of its existence was a story, a puzzle that screamed to be solved. The match burned down, scorching her fingertips, and plunged the hole back into darkness. But the image was seared into her mind. A tremor ran through her body, a violent shudder that was part fear, part exhilaration. This was real. She hadn't imagined it. Without a second thought, she swung her legs into the opening, the rough stone scraping her jeans, and lowered herself into the cramped, cold space. The air was frigid and completely still, the silence so profound it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. She landed with a soft thud on the stone floor, her knees jarring from the impact. For a moment, she just stood there in the absolute darkness, her senses overwhelmed. The smell of damp earth and cold metal was overpowering. She ran her hands along the smooth, cold walls, feeling the masterful stonework. This was no mere hiding spot. It was a vault, a tomb. Her fingers, numb with cold and anticipation, brushed against the metal box. It was even heavier than it looked, and cold as ice, a solid, unyielding presence in the dark. It was locked. Of course, it was locked. A small rusty latch on the front refused to budge. Climbing out of the compartment, she frantically searched the cabin for something, anything, to use as a tool. Her eyes landed on a heavy iron poker resting by the fireplace, one of the few items left behind by the previous occupants. Its weight was reassuring in her hand. A sense of frantic urgency had completely taken over. The gnawing hunger, the bitter cold, the crushing despair. It all vanished, replaced by a single overwhelming need to open that box. She lowered herself back into the dark space, the iron poker feeling like a weapon in her hand. She wedged the tip into the small gap between the lid and the body of the box, right next to the stubborn latch. She took a deep breath, the cold, stale air burning her lungs, and threw all of her weight against the poker. For a moment, nothing happened. The metal held firm, a silent testament to its purpose. She felt a surge of frustration. To be so close, to have this tangible secret in her hands, and to be denied at the final moment was unbearable. She tried again, repositioning the poker and pushing with a desperate grunt. This time, she was rewarded with a loud groaning shriek of tortured metal. The sound was deafening in the small, enclosed space. Rust flaked away, showering her hand with gritty particles. She pushed harder, and with a final explosive crack that sounded like a gunshot, the latch broke. The lid, freed from its long imprisonment, sprang upwards an inch. A new smell wafted out, entirely different from the earthy scent of the compartment. It was the dry, papery scent of old books and the faint, almost metallic aroma of something else, something she couldn't place. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely function. Using the tips of her fingers, she slowly, reverently, lifted the heavy lid. It opened with a low, mournful creak, the sound of a long-held secret finally being released into the world. The faint ambient light from the fire above spilled into the opening, illuminating the contents within. Her breath escaped her in a choked gasp. The first thing she saw, nestled on a bed of what looked like yellowed wool, was a small pouch made of dark, rich velvet. It was tied shut with a faded silk cord. Even in the dim light, the fabric had a deep, luxurious sheen that seemed utterly alien in this place of rot and decay. It felt like an artifact from another universe, a piece of forgotten royalty. With trembling fingers, she lifted it from the box. It was surprisingly heavy, the weight dense and concentrated in her palm. It felt like a small bag of stones. A cold dread mixed with a wild, irrational hope washed over her. Her fingers fumbled with the knot on the silk cord, her knuckles white. The knot gave way, and she loosened the drawstring, tilting the pouch. What tumbled into her palm was not a collection of ordinary river stones. They were rough, crystalline, and they caught the dim firelight with a dull, internal fire of their own. Raw diamonds, uncut, unpolished, but unmistakable. Clara stared at the stones in her palm, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. There were at least a dozen of them, some as small as her fingernail, others the size of a robin's egg. They were worth a fortune. More money than she could possibly comprehend. A hysterical laugh, high and brittle, bubbled up in her throat. It was the sound of a mind stretched to its breaking point. Just hours ago, she had been on the verge of freezing to death. Her world shrunk to the single, desperate need for warmth. Now she was holding a king's ransom in her dirty, calloused hand. The sheer, savage irony of it was overwhelming. It felt like a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and cold. She squeezed one of the stones so hard its sharp edges dug into her palm, the pain a welcome, grounding sensation. This was real. The diamonds were real, and they were here, in this rotting cabin at the absolute edge of the world. The discovery didn't feel like a salvation. It felt like a terrifying new burden. Her gaze fell back into the open box. The treasure, as unbelievable as it was not the only thing inside. Beneath the indentation where the velvet pouch had rested lay something else. It was a book, bound in dark, cracked leather, its cover bare of any title. Next to it sat a neat stack of papers, yellowed with age and tied together with a brittle piece of string. They were covered in precise, angular lines and strange symbols, along with a script she couldn't immediately read. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to brace herself against the cold stone wall of the compartment. The diamonds were a shock, a sudden, inexplicable fortune, but these items, these felt different. They felt more important, more dangerous. The diamonds were wealth, but the book and the papers were a story. They were the key, the explanation for why a fortune was buried under the floor of a derelict cabin in the middle of nowhere. This was the true secret. She reached into the box and carefully lifted the journal. The leather was cold and stiff, cracking slightly at the spine as she handled it. It smelled of dust and time and leather polish, a scent of civilization and intellect that was a world away from the pervasive mildew of the cabin. It felt heavy in her hands, not just with its physical weight, but with the weight of the words and secrets it held within its pages. Who had written this? Was it her great-uncle? The man she barely remembered? What could he have written that was so important it needed to be buried with a fortune in diamonds? 1,000 questions exploded in her mind, each one more urgent than the last. The initial mystery of the loose stone had opened a door, and now she found herself in a vast, dark room filled with even more locked doors. The desperation for survival had been replaced by a desperate need for answers. The stakes had changed completely. Next, she lifted the stack of yellow documents. The paper was incredibly brittle, and she handled it with the utmost care, terrified it would crumble to dust in her hands. She held them closer to the firelight spilling from above. They weren't letters. They were maps, or at least they looked like maps. Geological surveys, she realized, her eyes tracing the contour lines and the strange, coded notations, and tucked within them were deeds, old land deeds, written in an elegant, in-looping script that was difficult to decipher, proof of what she didn't know. But her intuition screamed at her that these papers were the heart of the matter. The diamonds were the prize, the journal was the story, and these documents were the proof that could perhaps change everything, or get her killed. The thought landed with the cold, heavy weight of one of the stones in her hand. This secret had been buried for a reason, and people who bury secrets this valuable often do so to protect them from very dangerous people. She sat there for a long time in the cramped, cold vault, the metal box open before her, the raw diamonds in her lap, and the leather journal clutched in her hand. The fire crackled merrily above her, a sound that now seemed distant, belonging to another world. The world of simple survival she had inhabited just an hour ago was gone forever. She had stumbled out of a wilderness of poverty and into a wilderness of secrets. She felt a terror so profound it made her entire body tremble. This discovery was not a simple solution to her problems. It was not a lottery ticket. It was a key that unlocked a history she knew nothing about, a history that was clearly steeped in wealth, lies, and danger. The air in the small space felt thick, heavy with the ghost of the person who had made this vault. A man who had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide his findings. What had he been so afraid of? The question hung in the cold, silent air, and Clara had a chilling premonition that she was about to find out. Carefully, she placed the diamonds back into their velvet pouch and returned them, along with the journal and the documents, to the cold metal box. She closed the lid, the soft click of the broken latch echoing in the silence. The weight of the box, as she lifted it out of the compartment, felt immense. It was the weight of a life-changing and possibly life-ending secret. She climbed out of the hole, her muscles aching, her mind reeling. Leo had fallen asleep by the fire, his face peaceful in the warm glow, blissfully unaware of how their world had just been irrevocably tilted on its axis. She looked from his innocent face to the rusted box in her hands. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with something else, a flicker of steel, a spark of the same fierce determination that had driven her to build a fire to keep her son warm. This secret had found her for a reason, and she would not let the fear of the unknown stop her from finding out what it was. Clara slid the heavy stone back into place over the dark hole, the grating sound sealing the secret away once more. The hearth was whole again, the only evidence of what lay beneath a few fresh scratches on the stone and the fine layer of dust on the floor. But the room was no longer the same. The cabin was no longer just a ruin. It was a treasure chest, a crime scene, a puzzle box. The very air seemed to vibrate with a new and dangerous energy. She placed the iron box in the corner, covering it with a dirty blanket, hiding it from sight, but intensely aware of its presence. It was a pulsating heart of mystery in the corner of their squalid little world. She sat down by the fire, pulling her own thin blanket around her shoulders, but the warmth from the flames couldn't touch the icy chill that had settled deep within her. The gnawing hunger in her stomach was gone, replaced by a different kind of hunger, a ravenous appetite for the truth. Her journey into the dark heart of the mountains had just begun. Clara waited until Leo was sound asleep, his soft, rhythmic breaths a fragile meter in the near-silent cabin. Only then, with a tremor running through her arms, did she retrieve the iron box. A profound sense of trespass, of grave robbing, made her hands tremble violently as she lifted the leather-bound journal. The spine cracked with a dry snap, a sound like old bones, releasing a cloud of scent, dry paper, faded ink, and something else. A faint, clean smell of academic diligence. She ran her fingers over the smooth, cold, embossed cover, feeling the ghost of the hands that held it last. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in her rib cage, beating against her bones. This felt more intimate and far more dangerous than finding the diamonds. The gems were inert wealth, but this book was a soul, a voice about to speak from the grave. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and incredibly precise, a beautiful, elegant script. The ink a faded sepia. It was the work of a patient, intelligent man. The first dozen pages were filled with meticulous, passionless observations. Clara's finger traced the lines as she read by the flickering firelight. Jedediah Croft had documented the geological formations of the ridge, the composition of the soil, the flow of the streams. He wrote of schist, granite, and quartz veins with the dry affection of a lifelong academic. Clara felt a strange kinship with this unseen relative, a man who, like her, found order and purpose in careful, detailed work. The words painted a vivid auditory picture of his life here, the sharp tink-tink-tink of his geological hammer against rock, the rustle of his pencil across paper, the profound humming silence of the forest that was his laboratory. A growing sadness filled her chest. This was a man who loved this land, who understood its deepest secrets. She felt the texture of the crisp, dry paper under her thumb, each page a testament to a life of quiet, intense focus. He was not just a recluse, he was a scholar of the earth. Then, about halfway through the journal, the tone of the entries shifted abruptly. The precise academic script became slightly more hurried, the loops and crosses imbued with a palpable excitement. A date was circled 3 times. October 12th. Beneath it, a single, explosive sentence. The kimberlite pipe is here, not a theory. I am standing on it. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what a kimberlite pipe was, but Jedediah's next words left no room for doubt. He described finding the first sample, the specific weight of the stone in his hand, the way it felt different, denser than anything else in the region. A wave of goosebumps broke out across her skin, a cold thrill of discovery by proxy. He had found the source. He had found the origin of the diamonds she now possessed. The journal entry ended with a scrawled, almost illegible phrase, a stark contrast to his earlier precision. My God, the sheer, impossible, glorious truth of it. The raw emotion in the words vibrated off the page. She quickly cross-referenced the journal entry with the stack of documents. Her hands, slick with a nervous sweat, fumbled with the brittle string, tying them together. She unrolled the largest map on the dusty floor. It was a topographical survey of this exact plot of land, her land rendered in exquisite, painstaking detail. Her eyes scanned the foreign symbols until she found it, a small, precise X marked in red ink, situated not 200 yards from the cabin itself, near an old, gnarled oak tree she recognized from her trips to gather firewood. The documents were the proof. They contained core sample analyses, mineral assays, and meticulously logged notes that confirmed the discovery. The diamonds in the box weren't a random treasure, they were samples. They were the first fruits of a geological jackpot buried right beneath her feet. A dizzying vertigo washed over her. She was sitting on a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings. The knowledge was terrifying, a weight that settled deep in her gut. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in her stomach as she read on. The journal entries that followed the discovery were no longer filled with scientific wonder. They were infected with a creeping, chilling paranoia. The elegant script grew tighter, more angular, as if carved into the page with a nervous hand. "I feel watched." The short sentence stood alone on a page, stark and terrifying. Jedediah wrote of finding boot prints near his survey sites that were not his own, of the unnerving snap of a twig in the woods when there was no wind, of the distinct feeling of eyes on his back as he worked. The silence of the forest, once his sanctuary, had transformed into a source of menace. Clara felt a sympathetic fear crawl up her own spine. She instinctively glanced at the crude blanket she had hung over the broken window, suddenly feeling exposed. The cabin, her only shelter, suddenly felt like a fragile glass box, its walls thin and utterly transparent to the vast, watching darkness of the woods outside. Then she found the name. It appeared for the first time in an entry dated a week after the paranoid scribblings began. Silas Blackwood. The name was written with such force that the pen had nearly torn through the fragile paper. A cold shiver, sharp and violent, ran down Clara's back. A new player had entered the story. "He knows," Jedediah had written, "or he suspects. The man is a vulture. He can smell wealth under the earth like a predator smells blood. He owns the mines to the north, controls the sheriff, holds this whole county in his fist, and he has been asking questions in town." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't some phantom. This was a real person, a powerful man. The open loop of the mystery was rapidly tightening into a noose. The faceless danger now had a name, and that name felt like a curse spoken aloud in the small, firelit room. She felt as if the very air had grown colder, heavier, charged with the presence of this unseen threat. She was no longer just reading a story. She was living in its terrifying next chapter. The following pages detailed Jedediah's growing terror. He described Blackwood as a man who moved with an unnatural stillness, whose eyes were like chips of cold slate, and whose voice was a smooth, placid river running over a bed of sharp, dangerous rocks. He visited today, spoke of the beauty of the land, the peace of the wilderness, but his eyes were not on the trees. They were on the ground. He is a geologist of greed. The description made Clara's skin crawl. She could almost smell the man's expensive cologne, see his polished shoes standing in the mud. The journal became a chronicle of Jedediah's desperate attempt to protect his discovery, his legacy. He wrote of his decision to hide his work, to create a secure place where the truth could wait for someone trustworthy to find it. Clara looked towards the hearth, her gaze fixed on the heavy stone she had moved. A profound sorrow washed over her. This vault wasn't a treasure chest. It was a time capsule, a message in a bottle from a man who knew he was about to drown. The construction of the hidden compartment was detailed over several entries. The physical labor, the secrecy, the constant fear. Jedediah wrote of working only at night, his hands raw from moving the heavy stones. Every sound from the forest sending a jolt of pure adrenaline through his veins. He described lining the vault, choosing the sturdiest metal box he could find, and wrapping his precious proofs in oilcloth. "This truth is all I have. It is the work of my life. I cannot let that monster steal it. I will not let it die with me." The words were a plea, a last will and testament written in the language of fear and defiance. Clara felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of pity and a strange, burgeoning anger. This man, her relative, had been hunted. He had been driven to bury his life's work like a dog buries a bone, terrified of the alpha predator circling his territory. She clutched the journal to her chest, the cold leather a stark reality against her thin shirt. This was her inheritance, not the land, not the diamonds, this story of injustice. The final entry was dated November 3rd. The handwriting was a barely controlled scrawl, the words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. A large, dark blot of spilled ink obscured the first few words, as if the pen had slipped from a trembling hand. Blackwood returned, made an offer, an insult. I refused. He smiled. A terrible, thin line. He said accidents happen in these woods. A man could trip during a hunt. He was not talking about hunting. I hear an engine on the logging road. It has no reason to be here this late. They're coming for me. If you are reading this, Clara, my sister's granddaughter, know that it was no accident. The proof is yours now. Avenge me. A choked sob escaped Clara's lips. The book slipped from her nerveless fingers and landed on the floor with a soft thud. It was a confession, a murder confession, written by the victim just moments before his death. The air was knocked from her lungs, and a wave of pure, undiluted terror, colder and more profound than any she had ever known, crashed over her. 2 days passed in a fog of fear. Clara barely ate or slept. The journal's words were burned into her mind, and the rust-colored metal box in the corner seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with threat. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, was now the sound of Blackwood's men coming for her. Then, on the third afternoon, a new sound intruded, a noise so alien it made her blood run cold. It was the deep, guttural rumble of a powerful truck engine, a sound of modern intrusion that tore through the ancient quiet of the woods. It grew closer, whining as it navigated the muddy logging road. A wave of nausea rose in her throat. She ran to the window, peering through a crack in the boards. A pristine, gleaming black pickup truck, impossibly large and new, was pulling into the clearing. The engine cut out, and for a moment, an unnatural silence descended, more menacing than the noise it had replaced. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. The driver's side door opened with a solid, expensive-sounding click. A man stepped out, and the sight of him stole the air from Clara's lungs. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a mane of thick, silver hair perfectly combed back from a weathered, eye-severe face. He wore a heavy wool coat that was clearly custom-tailored, and his boots, though he now stood on muddy, leaf-strewn ground, were polished to a mirror shine. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated cabin with an air of pure, contemptuous ownership. This was him. It had to be. He radiated an aura of immense power and cold, reptilian stillness. He was a creature of boardrooms and backroom deals, utterly out of place and yet completely in command of this wild, rustic setting. Clara shrank back from the window, her body trembling uncontrollably. She felt like a mouse cowering in the shadow of a circling hawk. This was Silas Blackwood. The monster from the journal had just materialized on her doorstep. He walked to the door and knocked. The sound was not a polite rap. It was a loud, authoritative summons. 2 sharp thuds that echoed through the small cabin like hammer blows. Leo, startled, let out a small cry. Clara's mind raced. Run! Hide! There was nowhere to go. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force the terror down, and opened the splintered door just a crack. His eyes met hers. They were exactly as the journal described, pale, cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Mum," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone, as smooth as polished river stones. "Silas Blackwood, I own the adjacent property. I heard someone had moved into the old Croft place. Came to welcome you to the neighborhood." A smile touched his thin lips, but it did not reach his eyes. "It's not much of a place, I'm afraid. Hasn't been for a long time. Your great-uncle let it go to ruin." His words were honey-laced poison, each one a subtle dismissal of her, of the cabin, of Jedediah's entire existence. Clara clutched the door, her knuckles white. She felt the immense weight of the secret she was carrying, the rusted box in the corner, a burning presence at her back. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. We're managing." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound like stones rattling in a jar. "Brave of you, but this is no place for a woman and a child. Tell you what, I had a fondness for old Jedediah, despite his eccentricities. For sentiment's sake, I'll take this worthless patch of land off your hands, give you $500 a cash, enough for you and the boy to get a bus ticket to somewhere civilized and start over." $500. The offer was a calculated insult, a paltry sum for land he knew was worth millions. Clara's terror was suddenly pierced by a hot flash of pure, unadulterated rage. He was standing on the grave of a man he had murdered, trying to buy the evidence of his crime for pocket change. The sheer audacity of it left her breathless. His eyes narrowed, the thin veil of cordiality slipping. He had seen the flicker of defiance in her face. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a sound meant only for her. His cologne, a mix of expensive spice and cedar, was cloying and invasive. He glanced past her, his cold eyes landing on Leo, who was hiding behind her legs. "You should take the offer, ma'am," he purred, the friendliness now completely gone, replaced by a silken menace. "You need to think about the boy. These old woods, they can be a dangerous place, full of snakes, unstable ground from the old mining days. Unfortunate accidents are all too common out here for folks who don't know the territory." The words slammed into Clara with the force of a physical blow. They were almost the exact same words from her great-uncle's final, terrified journal entry. It wasn't a warning, it was a direct, bone-chilling threat. He was telling her he had killed before, and he would not hesitate to kill again. He straightened up, the pleasant mask sliding back into place, but his eyes remained as cold and hard as the diamonds buried nearby. "You think on it," he said, tipping an imaginary hat. He turned and walked back to his truck with the same unhurried, proprietary stride. The engine roared back to life, and the truck disappeared down the muddy track, leaving behind only the lingering smell of diesel fumes and a silence that was now thick with mortal terror. Clara sagged against the doorframe, her legs threatening to give out. Her entire body was shaking, not from the cold, but from the icy certainty of her situation. He knew. He didn't know for sure what she had found, but he knew she was a threat. The secret in the iron box was no longer a historical puzzle. It was a loaded gun, and she was trapped in a room with a killer who wanted it back. What would you do in her place? Confront a man who controls everything, or run for your life, abandoning any hope for justice? The sound of Blackwood's truck faded, leaving a silence 100 times more terrifying than its roar. Clara stood frozen, the man's threat echoing in the hollow space of the cabin. A venomous whisper that coiled around her heart. Unfortunate accidents. He had confessed. He had stood on the land he stole, looked into his victim's heir's eyes, and confessed. Her body was a taut wire of pure terror, vibrating with an energy so intense she thought she might shatter. A violent shiver racked her frame, a convulsion of fear that started in her stomach and radiated outwards. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. She looked down at Leo, whose face was a mask of confusion and fear. Blackwood's eyes had lingered on him. That was the true threat. The cold gaze had not been a warning to her. It was a promise of what she stood to lose. A primal, protective fury, hot and volcanic, erupted through the ice of her fear, giving her a sudden, terrible clarity. She could not stay here. She could not run. She needed help. Her mind, frantic and desperate, clawed through the pages of the journal. Her memory snagged on a single, almost forgotten line from Jedediah's early entries, before the paranoia had taken root. "Shared a coffee with Elias this morning. He is a good man, though the world has made him cautious. The only soul in these hills who understands the value of quiet. Elias, a neighbor, the only friend, hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her terror. But where? The mountains stretched for endless, intimidating miles in every direction, a monolithic wilderness that swallowed all signs of life. She ran to the broken window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She scanned the dense, darkening tree line, searching for any sign, any clue, and then she saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible plume of white smoke rising against the deep purple of the twilight sky, far to the west. It was a thin, fragile thread of existence in the vast emptiness. A chimney, a hearth, a life. It had to be him. It was a chance, as thin and fragile as the smoke itself, but it was the only one she had. It was a signal fire in the midst of a hostile, darkening world, and she knew she had to follow it. The decision was instant, an act of pure survival instinct. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy she didn't know she possessed. First, the box. She pulled it from its hiding place, the cold, rusted metal, a heavy, solid weight of truth in her arms. It was everything. It was the motive, the evidence, and the legacy. She wrapped it in their only spare blanket, a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. She grabbed Leo's hand, his small fingers cold and trembling in her own. "We have to go for a walk, sweetie," she whispered, her voice a strained, false calm that she didn't feel. "We're going to visit a friend." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She could feel his fear, a palpable thing radiating from his small body. He didn't ask questions, just clung to her hand, his wide eyes fixed on her face. his complete trust a crushing weight on her soul. She took one last look at the squalid cabin, its shadows deep and menacing in the dying light. She was plunging from a known hell into an unknown one, armed with nothing but a dead man's story and a prayer. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick, decaying leaves and hidden roots. Every step was a gamble. The heavy, blanket-wrapped box threw off her balance, its weight a constant, awkward burden that strained every muscle in her arms and back. The air grew colder as darkness fell, a damp, penetrating chill that seeped through her thin jacket and settled deep in her bones. The woods, which had seemed menacing before, were now actively malevolent. Every gust of wind whispering through the pines sounded like Blackwood's silken, threatening voice. Every shadow that danced at the edge of her vision was a henchman lying in wait. The snap of a twig under her foot sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence, making her heart leap into her throat. Fear was a living creature walking beside her, its cold breath on her neck. She pushed onward, her gaze locked on the memory of that distant smoke, her only compass in a world that had dissolved into a terrifying labyrinth of black trees and suffocating fear. Leo stumbled beside her, his small legs struggling to keep pace. He didn't complain, but she could hear his small, hitching breaths and feel the drag of his weight on her arm. The guilt was a physical pain, a sharp stitch in her side. She had brought him here to this place of rot and danger, and now she was dragging him through a dark, cold forest toward a stranger's house on a desperate, half-mad hope. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over her. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. She was failing him. At every turn she was failing him. But then she felt the hard corner of the iron box bump against her leg, a solid reminder of the truth she carried. This wasn't just for her. It was for Jedediah. It was for the fortune that could give Leo a life she could only dream of. It was for the justice that her murdered great-uncle deserved. The thought was a small, hard kernel of strength in the churning sea of her fear, and she tightened her grip on Leo's hand, forcing her legs to move forward. After what felt like an eternity, a new smell cut through the damp, earthy scent of the woods. Wood smoke, rich, fragrant and real. It grew stronger with every step, a lifeline of scent pulling her forward. Then, a light. A single, golden square of it, glowing warmly in the oppressive darkness. It was a window, a home. Relief so profound it almost buckled. Her knees washed over her. As they emerged from the dense tree line into a small, neat clearing, she saw the source. It was a tiny cabin, no bigger than her own, but it was a world apart. The roof was solid, the windows were glazed and whole, and the porch was swept clean. A neat stack of firewood stood against one wall, and the air of careful, quiet order was a balm to her frayed nerves. It smelled of safety. It smelled of sanctuary. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, the iron box suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She was about to bring her storm of danger and death to this island of peace. Was it right? But the memory of Blackwood's cold eyes gave her no choice. She took a deep, shuddering breath and walked across the clearing, her soaked sneakers squelching in the soft earth. She stepped onto the solid wood of the porch and gently set down the heavy box. Her knuckles were white as she raised her hand to knock. It felt like the most momentous act of her life. Before her hand could make contact, the door creaked open. A man stood silhouetted in the warm light from within. He was old, stooped with age, with a face as wrinkled and weathered as an old tree root. He held an old shotgun, its long barrel pointed casually but firmly at the floor. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and intensely suspicious. They flickered from her face, to Leo hiding behind her, to the blanket-wrapped box on the porch. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with caution, and the unspoken questions of a man long accustomed to being left alone. The smell of stew and strong coffee drifted from the warm room behind him, a scent of simple comfort that made Clara's stomach ache with a hunger that was for more than just food. "Mr. Elias?" Clara's voice was a raw, broken whisper. It barely sounded like her own. The name hung in the cold night air between them. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, his grip tightening on the shotgun. He was not a welcoming man. He was a fortress. Clara's desperation, however, was a battering ram. Tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back began to stream down her cold cheeks, hot against her skin. "Please," she choked out, the word tearing from her throat. "My name is Clara. I'm Jedediah Croft's great-niece. You have to help me. Please, he's going to kill us." The words tumbled out, a frantic, incoherent flood. She pointed a trembling finger back in the direction of her own dark, ruined cabin. Silas Blackwood. He was there. He threatened my son. At the mention of Blackwood's name, a flicker of something new appeared in the old man's eyes. It wasn't just suspicion now. It was fear. A deep, ancient fear that he had clearly lived with for a very long time. He stared at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the dim porch light. His gaze dropped again to the blanket-wrapped box at her feet. Without a word, he stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was an invitation, a reluctant, terrified invitation. Clara practically collapsed into the small, one-room cabin, pulling Leo with her. The warmth of the room was a physical shock, a thick, comforting blanket that immediately began to thaw her frozen limbs. A fire crackled in a small iron stove, and a single oil lamp cast a gentle, golden glow over everything. The air was filled with the smell of brewing coffee and pine sap. It was a haven, a pocket of warmth and life carved out of the vast, cold darkness. Elias closed the door, the solid thud of the bolt sliding home a deeply reassuring sound. He leaned his shotgun against the wall and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of profound weariness and grim resignation, as if he had been expecting this knock on his door for years. Clara sank into a simple wooden chair he gestured towards, her body trembling with a mixture of cold, exhaustion, and residual terror. Leo huddled against her, his eyes wide as he took in the strange, safe room. With numb fingers, Clara unwrapped the blanket from the iron box and placed it on the rough-hewn wooden table between them. The rusted metal seemed to absorb the lamplight, a dark, malevolent object in the warm, peaceful space. "Jedediah left this," she said, her voice still shaking. "He left a journal." She lifted the heavy lid and carefully took out the leather-bound book. She didn't need to open it. She just pushed it across the table towards him. Her entire future, her son's life, rested on this single, desperate act of trust. She was handing her story, her secret, to a complete stranger, praying he was the man her great-uncle had believed him to be. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. The only sound in the room, the crackle of the fire, and the low ticking of an old mantel clock. Elias reached out a hand that trembled slightly, his gnarled, arthritic fingers tracing the worn leather cover of the journal. He didn't open it immediately. He just touched it, a look of profound, heart-wrenching sadness on his face. "Jedediah's," he murmured, his voice raspy with disuse and emotion. "I haven't seen his script in 20 years. He finally opened the book, his pale eyes scanning the familiar, precise handwriting. A low, guttural sound, a sob of old grief, escaped his lips. He turned the pages slowly, his breath catching as he read the final, frantic entries. Clara watched him, saw the dawning horror, the confirmation of a suspicion he had clearly buried deep within himself for 2 decades. The silence in the room became heavy, thick with the ghost of a murdered man and the weight of a long-held secret. The old man's face, already a roadmap of wrinkles, seemed to age another 10 years right before her eyes. He had known. On some level, he had always known. When he finally looked up from the journal, his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a deep, burning shame. "I saw them," he whispered. The words so quiet Clara had to lean in to hear them. "The day he died, I was up on the ridge, checking my traps. I saw Blackwood's truck on the logging road, and 2 of his men walking toward Jedediah's cabin." His voice broke. He paused, swallowing hard, the sound loud in the silent room. "They were carrying rifles," I told myself. I convinced myself they were just hunting. It was deer season. He stared down at his own trembling hands on the tabletop and unable to meet her gaze. Then I heard the shot. Just one. It didn't sound right for a hunting rifle. Too sharp. Too final. The woods went silent after. All the birds, everything. Like the whole world was holding its breath. The sensory memory was so vivid, so painful, that Clara felt a chill despite the warmth of the stove. He was painting a picture of the moment of murder. "I saw them leave an hour later," he continued, his voice thick with self-loathing. "They weren't carrying a deer. They were just walking. I hid. I was a coward. I hid in the trees and I watched them drive away. He finally lifted his head, and the guilt in his eyes was a raw, open wound. Jedediah was my only friend. He was a good, quiet man who never hurt a soul, and I let him die. I was too afraid of Blackwood to say anything. The sheriff, the judge, they're all in his pocket. It would have been my word against his. I would have had an accident of my own. He gestured around the small, tidy cabin. This little piece of the world is all I have. I was afraid to lose it, so I said nothing. I've lived with that silence, with that shame, every single day for 20 years. The confession filled the small room, a heavy, poisonous thing that had been festering in the dark for 2 decades. Now, brought into the light, it seemed to transform the old man before her very eyes. A new light kindled in Elias's watery eyes, a hard, cold flame of resolve that burned away the shame. He looked from the journal to the box, then to Clara's face. "But this," he said, his voice stronger now, harder, "this changes everything. This is the proof I never had. It's his own words, his own work." He tapped the stack of geological surveys with a decisive finger. "Blackwood can't bury a dead man's voice, not when it's written in ink." The fear had not vanished from his face, but it had been cornered by a grim, righteous anger. He was no longer just a frightened old man. He was a witness, finally armed with the evidence to back up his testimony. He felt a duty to his dead friend, a chance to finally exorcise the ghost of his own cowardice. A silent pact was forged between them across the rough wooden table. They were two terrified, outmatched people, a reclusive old man and a destitute single mother, but together they held the truth. And in that truth, there was a sliver of power. "You can't go to the local sheriff," Elias said, his tone urgent and sharp. He was all business now, the strategist emerging from the hermit. "He's Blackwood's man. He's been on his payroll for 30 years. He'd make one phone call, and that box and both of you would disappear before morning. No one would ever find you." The bluntness of his statement sent a fresh wave of ice through Clara's veins. It confirmed every fear she'd had since reading the journal. The corruption was total. They were on an island, surrounded by a sea of Blackwood's influence. "There's no one in this county we can trust. No one." He stood up and began to pace the small space, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The rhythmic sound was like a clock ticking down, measuring their rapidly shrinking window of opportunity. He was thinking, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, his mind working through decades of knowledge about his enemy and the terrain they both inhabited. "He knows you came here," Elias stated, stopping his pacing to look at her. "He may not have seen you, but he knows you would seek out Jedediah's only friend. He will assume you've talked. He will assume you know." The logic was chilling and inescapable. Blackwood's visit to her cabin hadn't just been a threat. It had been an act of flushing his prey out of hiding, to see where it would run, and she had run right here. "He can't afford to let us both be alive by morning with what we know. His time for subtle threats is over. He'll act tonight, and he'll act directly." The certainty in Elias's voice was absolute. Clara's blood ran cold. The fragile safety of this warm, solid cabin evaporated in an instant, replaced by the terrifying realization that it was now the primary target. She looked at Leo, who had finally fallen asleep in the chair, his head resting in her lap. His peaceful, innocent face was a stark contrast to the mortal danger that was rapidly closing in on them. "Here is what we must do," Elias said, his voice low and firm, the voice of a commander. "He will go for your cabin first. He'll think the journal and the papers are still there. He wants them. But more than that, he wants to destroy them. Fire. It's the easiest way. It cleans up everything." His plan was taking shape, born of a desperate necessity and a deep understanding of his adversary. "You must go back there. Now." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Go back. Into the trap." The thought was insane. "He needs to see you there. He needs to think you are alone and terrified. It will keep his attention focused on that cabin. And away from this one, it will buy us time." It was a horrifying gamble, using herself and her son as bait. A wave of protest rose in her throat, but Elias held up a hand, his eyes locking with hers, silently pleading with her to trust him. He was asking for an almost impossible leap of faith, to walk willingly back into the lion's den. "I will not be far," he promised, his voice a raw whisper of reassurance. "I know these woods better than my own name. I know paths Blackwood and his city thugs have never seen. While they are watching your front door, I will be in the trees behind the cabin. I will be waiting." He walked to a small, dusty chest in the corner and pulled out an old, blackened oil lantern and a box of matches. "When they come, they will make noise. They are arrogant and clumsy. You will hear them. The moment you do, you take the boy and the box, and you go out the back window. Don't hesitate. Don't think. Just go. I will be there. I will be waiting for you in the shadows by the old creek bed. I swear it on my friendship with Jedediah." He pressed the lantern into her cold hands. The metal was cool and solid, a tangible piece of a desperate, terrifying plan. He was asking her to risk everything on his word, on his ability to be a ghost in the woods. Her heart screamed no, but her mind knew it was their only chance. The journey back to her own cabin was the most terrifying experience of Clara's life. The darkness was no longer just a lack of light. It was a living entity, filled with the monstrous shapes of her fear. The iron box felt 100 times heavier, a tombstone chained to her arm. Leo, now awake and whimpering softly, clung to her side. She moved in a crouch, trying to be silent, but every snapped twig, every rustle of her jacket sounded like a thunderclap. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a target in a shooting gallery. The faint light of Elias's lantern, which she kept shielded, did little to pierce the oppressive gloom, serving only to make the surrounding darkness seem deeper and more menacing. The air was heavy and still, pregnant with unspoken violence. She could feel Blackwood's presence everywhere, an invisible web of malice that covered the entire forest. She was a fly, walking deliberately back into the spider's parlor, and every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn and run. Reaching the clearing, she extinguished the lantern, plunging them into near-total blackness. The cabin was a dark, hunched shape against the starless sky, a gaping maw of shadow and rot. Forcing herself to enter its cold, familiar squalor was an act of supreme will. The smell of mildew and decay, once a symbol of her despair, was now laced with the sharp, metallic scent of pure terror. She set the box down by the back window, the one Elias had told her to use. The glass was already cracked, the frame rotten. She checked it, making sure it would give way easily. Then, she and Leo huddled in the farthest, darkest corner, pulling the thin, dirty blankets around them. And they waited. The silence was absolute. It was a crushing weight that pressed down on her, magnifying every frantic beat of her own heart, until it was a deafening drum in her ears. Time seemed to stretch and distort, each second an eternity, each minute a lifetime. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow, agonizing tightening of a wire around her soul. She must have drifted into a state of exhausted, hyper-vigilant stupor, because the sound, when it came, jolted her as if from a deep sleep. It was a low crunch of gravel from the logging road, a sound that did not belong to the night. Then, the distinct, soft click of a car door closing, muffled voices. Not one person, two, at least. Clara's heart stopped. They were here. A wave of ice water flooded her veins, and she clamped a hand over Leo's mouth to stifle the small cry of fear he made. She could hear their footsteps now, heavy and careless, crunching on the dry leaves as they approached the cabin. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were confident. Arrogant? They moved as if they owned the night itself. Clara's body was paralyzed, locked in a state of pure, primal terror. She was a mouse in a wall, listening to the cats prowl the kitchen. The sound of their boots on the rotting wood of the front porch was the sound of her own death approaching. Then, a new sound, a liquid sloshing, and a new smell, sharp and chemical, that cut through the musty air of the cabin. Gasoline. The scent of it filled her nostrils, a sickeningly sweet perfume of destruction. They were pouring it all over the front porch, splashing it against the dry, tinder-like walls of the cabin. A low, cruel chuckle drifted through the cracks in the wall, a sound utterly devoid of humanity. Clara's paralysis broke. Adrenaline, pure and potent, surged through her, overriding the fear. She scooped a terrified, trembling Leo into one arm and grabbed the handle of the iron box with the other. Her movements were swift and silent, fueled by a mother's fierce, desperate instinct to protect her child. She moved to the back window, her heart a wild, frantic thing threatening to burst from her chest. The entire front of the cabin was now saturated with fuel. All it would take was a single spark, and their world would become an inferno. She heard the scrape of a match. A sudden, bright orange flare of light bloomed outside the front window, painting the interior of the cabin in a momentary, hellish glow. "Now," she whispered to herself, and with a surge of desperate strength, she slammed her shoulder against the rotten back window frame. Wood splintered, and the entire frame, along with the cracked glass, burst outwards with a shower of debris and a crash that was swallowed by the sudden, violent whoosh as the front of the cabin ignited. A wall of heat and roaring sound erupted behind her. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled through the opening, scraping her arms and legs on the jagged wood, pulling a screaming Leo through after her. She landed hard in the dirt and mud outside, the iron box clutched in her hand. The night air was filled with the roar of the fire and the thick, acrid smoke that was already starting to choke her. The cabin was a funeral pyre, a blazing monument to Blackwood's evil. A hand grabbed her arm. She cried out, spinning around, ready to fight, to claw, to do anything to protect her son. But it was Elias, his weathered face, illuminated by the flickering, demonic light of the fire, was a mask of grim urgency. He was a silent shadow that had emerged from the deeper shadows of the woods. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes wide and commanding. He didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. He simply pointed into the impenetrable darkness of the forest behind him, away from the fire, away from the two silhouetted figures who were now staring, mesmerized, at their handiwork. He took Leo's other hand, and together the three of them melted into the safety of the trees. Clara risked one last glance over her shoulder. The cabin, her false hope and her prison, was being consumed by a pillar of flame that reached up into the night sky, devouring the last vestiges of her old life and illuminating the dark, uncertain path of their flight. Elias guided them through the impenetrable blackness, his presence a silent, reassuring anchor. The roaring inferno of the cabin behind them was a monstrous, hungry beast, its light painting the trees in demonic shades of orange and red. The smell of burning pine and their own incinerated past clung to their clothes and hair, a foul perfume of violence. Reaching his small haven, the solid thud of his door shutting out the chaos was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. The air inside, thick with the scent of coffee and old books, was the smell of survival itself. Elias moved to a dusty corner, his hand finding the old black landline phone. The rasping click, click, click of the rotary dial as he spun it was agonizingly slow, each number a turn of a key in a lock that might not open. A cold dread, mingled with a sliver of hope, made Clara's stomach clench. She clutched the heavy iron box to her chest, its cold reality the only thing keeping her grounded in the swirling vortex of the last hour. "It's Elias." The old man's voice was a gravelly whisper into the receiver. "He's here, Blackwood." Clara watched and frozen as the one-sided conversation unfolded. She couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but she heard the shift in Elias's tone from desperate plea to grim report. "Murder, son." "I saw it. Jedediah Croft. 20 years ago. We have proof. His journal, mineral surveys, everything." A wave of vertigo washed over Clara. This was it. The secret was finally being spoken into the world of law and consequence. Elias listened, nodding slowly. "She has the box. Her and her boy are with me. He burned her cabin down an hour ago." He paused. "Yes, federal protection. Understood. We'll be waiting." He hung up the phone, the finality of the act echoing in the small room. He looked at Clara, his eyes old and tired, but with a new light in them. "My nephew is a federal prosecutor," he said, his voice steady. "They're coming. They're bypassing the county. No one is telling Blackwood a thing." Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with the quiet arrival of authority. Two dark, unremarkable sedans crunched softly on the gravel outside, their engines cutting out to leave a profound, professional silence. Men in dark, practical suits emerged, their movements economical and devoid of panic. They were a stark contrast to the raw, untamed wilderness and the chaotic violence of the night. One of them, a man with a calm, serious face, knocked on Elias's door. There was no aggression, only purpose. Elias opened it, and the agent nodded respectfully. "Ma'am, I'm Special Agent Harris. Elias's nephew sent us. Clara felt the immense tension in her shoulders begin to unclasp. With trembling hands, she brought the iron box forward. "It's all in here," she whispered. The agent took the box with gloved hands, his touch reverent, as if accepting a holy relic. The physical weight left her arms, but it was the metaphorical weight lifted from her soul that almost made her collapse with relief. It was no longer her fight alone. Silas Blackwood sat on the expansive veranda of his opulent mountain estate, a cup of expensive coffee steaming in his hand. He wore a silk robe, the very picture of untouchable, feudal power. Watching the morning mist burn off the valleys he believed he owned, he had received the call from his henchman. The cabin was ash, the problem was solved. A thin, satisfied smile played on his lips. He never saw them coming. The federal agents moved with the silent, coordinated grace of a wolf pack. There was no loud siren, just the sudden, shocking splintering of his grand front door under the force of a battering ram. Blackwood shot to his feet, coffee splashing onto his robe, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. The cold, satisfying click of handcuffs ratcheting shut around his wrists echoed across the manicured lawn. His expression curdled from shock to a look of pure, venomous rage as he was led away. His empire of fear collapsing into dust in a single, silent morning raid. News of Blackwood's arrest swept through the Appalachian hollows like a cleansing fire. It wasn't a headline on the national news, but in the small towns and isolated homesteads, it was an earthquake. The decades of fear he had cultivated began to crack. People spoke his name openly for the first time, their voices no longer hushed whispers. At the Harlan Junction General Store, stories began to surface, emboldened by Elias's official testimony. Another old farmer came forward about a land deed signed under duress. A former miner spoke of safety violations that were deliberately buried by the Blackwood-owned sheriff, who was now facing his own federal indictment. Jedediah's journal, his lonely voice from the grave, had become a chorus for the silenced. For Clara, the justice was more profound than she could have imagined. It wasn't just for her great-uncle. It was for an entire community that had been living in the shadow of one man's monstrous greed for far too long, and now, finally, could see the sun. The lawyer's office in Charleston was a different universe. The air was cool and smelled of leather and success. Clara sat in a plush chair that had cost more than every worldly possession she once owned. Across the polished mahogany desk, a man in a perfectly tailored suit slid a document toward her. It was the official valuation of the diamonds from the box. After establishing your clear title of inheritance and federal seizure of the assets as evidence, the stones were professionally assayed, Miss Croft. Their raw value is... He pointed a manicured finger at a number on the page. Clara stared, but her brain refused to process the string of zeros. It was an astronomical figure, a number that belonged in financial reports, not in her life. She felt a wave of dizziness, her hand gripping the edge of the cool, smooth desk to steady herself. The memory of her fingers, grimy and desperate, counting out crumpled bills in a homeless shelter, $50 flashed in her mind. A single, silent tear of disbelief traced a path down her cheek. A few weeks later, she stood on the land, her land. The official deed, crisp and new, was in her hands, confirming her ownership of the entire parcel and its undisputed mineral rights. The charred skeleton of the old cabin was a dark scar on the landscape, but it no longer looked like a grave to her. It was a crucible, a place where her old life had burned away to reveal something new and strong. The wind whispered through the tall pines, and it was no longer a mournful howl, but a promise. The rich, earthy smell of the forest was not the scent of isolation, but of home. Leo, no longer a pale, shivering boy, ran laughing through a field of wildflowers, his voice bright and clear, echoing in the mountain air. Clara closed her eyes and felt the solid ground beneath her feet, a foundation of immense value, yes, but more importantly, a foundation for a future she could finally build herself. She wasn't a survivor anymore. She was a founder. The weight in her chest was gone, replaced by the light, airy feeling of boundless possibility. 6 months later, a new house stood where the ruin had been. Crafted from warm cedar and solid riverstone, it seemed to have grown organically from the mountainside. It was a home built not just with money, but with intention, designed to let the sunlight and the stunning views pour in through large unclean windows. The air inside smelled of baking bread and fresh paint, a stark contrast to the old, pervasive stench of rot and despair. Clara moved through a bright, spacious kitchen, pulling a roasting chicken from the oven. Her hands, once cracked and grimy, were now clean and soft. She glanced out the window, a smile touching her lips as she watched Leo on a brand new swing set, his legs pumping as he tried to touch the sky. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been her companion for so long was a ghost, a memory. In its place was a profound, quiet peace that settled deep in her bones. This was more than a house. It was a sanctuary she had earned, a fortress against the storms of the world. In a quiet, sunlit room upstairs, her grandmother's sewing machine sat on a polished wooden table. It had been meticulously restored, its black iron body gleaming, its gold decals shining like new. Bolts of vibrant, colorful fabric, silks, cottons, and wools were stacked neatly on shelves, a rainbow of creative potential. The machine was no longer a tombstone she had to lug around, a heavy monument to her failure. It was a tool of joy. The happy, rhythmic clatter of the machine filled the peaceful room as Clara expertly guided a piece of soft, royal blue cotton under the needle. She wasn't mending rags or patching holes out of desperation. She was creating. She was making a new button-down shirt for Leo, not because he needed it, but because she wanted to. The familiar motion was a meditation, each perfect stitch a small act of weaving her new life together, a life of security, abundance, and the simple, profound freedom to create something beautiful just for the love of it. The warm glow of the new fireplace illuminated three faces around a large oak dining table: Clara, Leo, and Elias. They were an unlikely family, forged in fire and fear, now bound by loyalty and love. The table was laden with roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and warm bread. The sounds were of easy laughter and the clinking of silverware, a symphony of peaceful domesticity. The gnawing hunger, the bitter cold, the suffocating desperation of the county shelter felt like a half-remembered nightmare from another lifetime. Clara looked at her son, his cheeks rosy and full, and at Elias, his old face relaxed in a genuine smile, and a feeling of gratitude so immense it was a physical pressure filled her chest. Her journey into darkness had led her to a treasure far greater than diamonds. It had led her home. True stories of courage against impossible odds remind us that even in the deepest despair, a hidden strength waits to be discovered. If you were moved by Clara's fight for justice, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss another story of hope and redemption.